as long as I can, really. There's a few more people drifting in, but I'm going to get things kicked off. I'd like to welcome everybody to VOX 2020, the theme for which is looking to the future. One potentially game-changing development for the industry this year, and this will be discussed across the conference rooms, show floor and networking events of ICE across the coming days, is the imminent review of the 2005 Gambling Act here in the UK. This is the largest regulated online market in the world and a core market for the companies of many sitting here in the audience here this morning. So for this year's opening keynote, we're delighted to bring you the political figure who's been most influential in bringing this review to the table, and that man is Tom Watson, the former Deputy Leader of the Opposition Labour Party. The review that's coming this year can be seen as a combination of 5 years spent by Mr. Watson advocating reform of how the GB industry is regulated and how it treats its players. The measures he campaigned for during that time include the now introduced max VOD stake. He's also advocated the creation of an industry ombudsman, a review of the GB remote licence holders system, and also a statutory levy to fund problem gambling research, education and treatment. And more latterly, a root and branch review of the Gambling Act. Due to his work, the gambling industry reform is now one of the few policy issues that receives cross-party support in the UK, as evidenced by its inclusion in the manifestos of all the major parties for the December's general election in the UK. While some of the measures he pushed for, first as an MP and then as Deputy Leader of Her Majesty's Opposition, were initially greeted with no little degree of wariness and pushback on the part of the industry, the extent to which the swing of public opinion against the industry in recent years, more recently, means his voice has come to be seen as far more moderate and constructive than initially thought. Indeed, with his standing down as an MP at the last election, the industry now faces the prospect of the debates about its future being dominated by parliamentarians potentially less willing to listen and engage with it. And it's in this spirit of continued engagement and dialogue that Mr. Watson is here today to address the industry's biggest and most global trade show. Please join me in welcoming Tom Watson.
Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Tom Watson, and until December, I was the Deputy Leader of the Labour Party and Shadow Culture Secretary, and since then, I've taken up a new role as a Sunday Times best-selling author of a weight loss book called Downsizing, available in all good bookshops for those of you that want to get fit. Now, I consider it a genuine pleasure and a great honour to be invited to speak to you this morning at VOX, to listen to your views, to engage with industry leaders and regulators from around the world. And I also judge it as a very encouraging sign that you are prepared to engage with lawmakers and regulators, to hear concerns and to shape the future of your own industry. Let's see if my confidence is misplaced in the next half an hour. I don't think it will be. Now, my life in politics has been driven by some simple values. That those with power should behave responsibly and reasonably in the exercise of their power and be accountable for their actions. That's why I stood up to Rupert Murdoch when his journalists were criminally hacking the phones of victims of crime and those in the public eye. And that the role of politicians is to create laws and regulations that prevent harm, but also promote the greatest good for the greatest number. And that's why I've campaigned against the kinds of sugar contents in food and drink that create diabetes, blindness, and amputations. And that free markets, if left unfettered, can create both great wealth and great misery. And that the role of regulation is to prevent the latter without extinguishing the former. Which brings me to the gambling industry. Now, let me set out this morning my guiding approach and principles when it comes to regulating gambling in the UK. Now, there are those whose approach to gambling is informed by Holy Writ. And these views and these discussions, they view through the prism of good versus evil. Now, I respect those motivated by faith. I've seen enough food banks run by churches, temples and gurdwaras to know religion can be a force for good. But notwithstanding the growing influence of those in our public life with a faith-based agenda on gambling, I don't view gambling in terms of angels and demons, in terms of black and white. For a start, I enjoy a bet myself on the horses, on football, or even on politics, which in recent years has been harder to predict than the outcome of the Grand National. But I recognise that for millions of people, betting, whether at the track or on the terraces or even a ticket for the lottery, it's just a bit of fun. It's part of our national culture. And of course, it employs thousands of people and generates millions of pounds for the Exchequer, paying for the schools and hospitals we all want for our families and children. So I'm no prohibitionist, hell-bent on saving the souls and closing down the bookies. What I want is a system of regulation which protects the vulnerable, sets sensible boundaries, allows reasonable rewards for the industry, encourages innovation, and lets you get on with your business. The system of regulation, I think, should reflect two factors, one ancient and one modern. The modern is, of course, the disruptive advance of technology. We're living through the digital revolution, characterized by speed, the speed of its unpredictability. The gaming industry is no less susceptible to this revolution than any other industry, from publishing to food manufacture. So we need an agile system of regulation capable of keeping up with the changes of technology and habits that we see all around us, not least here at this wonderful event this week. The fact is that when Her Majesty signed the UK Gambling Act in 2005, the technological terrain was entirely different. In 2005, Uber, Dropbox, Airbnb, Twitter, Spotify, Instagram, they didn't exist. The Act refers to betting by post more than betting online. It's the perfect example of legislation marooned by the tides of technological advance, unsuited to the task for which it was intended. Though I acknowledge that embedded within the Act is the ability for ministers to grant greater powers to the regulator. But the second factor, the ancient one, is the recognition of human frailty. That for some people, a harmless flutter is impossible. That a small bet always becomes a large one. That a trip to the casino or online can create financial mayhem and emotional turmoil. And what I cannot stand and will never accept is the psychological targeting of these vulnerable people with the most sophisticated forms of suggestion and promotion ever devised by man. That calibrated blend of sound, colour, music, and words designed to release chemicals in the brain and generate harmful behaviours, all for profit. This is simply unacceptable. So when designing games, you have a real responsibility to consider the impact on vulnerable customers. As an industry, it's simply not possible to turn a blind eye to the human costs and misery done to some people and their families. We can argue numbers and percentages, and I know we're talking about a minority of gamblers compared to the majority who know how and when to walk away. But one out-of-control addict, throwing away their future and that of their children, is one too many. So if good industry-wide regulation is the price of preventing one bankruptcy, one divorce, one death, then I know you will all agree that that is a price worth paying. The tragedy of our recent history on gaming machines in the UK called FOBTs is that instead of being prepared to approach its critics and find common ground, the industry doubled down, denounced its critics, including me, and dug even deeper. The result was regulation by a Conservative-led government, much tougher than the industry wanted, causing some real howls of anguish. Instead of stake reduction from £100 to £30 per spin, or even £10 per spin, ministers reduced it to £2 per spin. The industry, by its intransigence, ended up with a much worse outcome than if it had engaged with good grace and emollients. So the saga of FOBTs, I think, should inform our approach in the future. We should all learn from this experience. When I conducted Labour's policy work in this area, leading to the 2018 review of gambling, this was my approach. Not dogma, not settling scores, but instead an inclusive quest for what works. My team trod a middle ground focused on grown-up reform. And after engaging with industry, we called for multi-operator checks designed to protect potential problem gamblers. We wanted to curb gambling advertising in football, which has worked in Australia, and I was delighted that the industry promoted its own ban on advertising whistle to whistle. We called for an independent ombudsman. We wanted an overhaul of white labels, many of which have only tenuous links to the UK. And we called for a greater contribution and a more uniform and consistent one from across the industry to research into problem gambling and treatments for addicts. And I recognise too that the banks, loan companies and credit card companies have a huge responsibility in this area. And councils can do more to prevent underage gambling in arcades, pubs or cafes. And the tech giants can be better at signposting people to help, not further opportunities to gamble. It's not all on the shoulders of the gaming industry. I'm also pleased to see that the NHS is doing more to support and treat addicts. With 14 new clinics across the UK, there has been a welcome breaking of taboos around problem gambling, with respected public figures such as Peter Shilton being open about their addiction. However, we shouldn't lose sight that there are 320,000 problem gamblers in the UK. Our friends, co-workers, neighbours and loved ones. And demand for services still always outstrips supply. So I think we need an agenda for positive reform. And I know from my private conversations, many in the industry would be willing to countenance many of the ideas on the table. In short, reform is possible as well as desirable. And I think we should all recognise that a bare-knuckle fight to the death like we had over FOBTs does nobody any favours. And we should all commit to never, ever going back to those dark days of reform. I'm optimistic we can forge a new and productive relationship. There are new faces on all sides and a new dedication to make progress. A month ago, the all-party parliamentary group on gambling harm brought politicians together to report on progress. The House of Lords has an ongoing inquiry. The Department for Culture, Media and Sport Select Committee is cranking up again, and I have no doubt will want to take a look afresh at the industry. The new Betting and Gaming Council is a welcome and positive step, and I'm delighted to see my former colleague from 10 Downing Street and the parliamentary front bench, Michael Duggar, starting his first hour in his first day of his new big job, having to listen to a speech from his former parliamentary colleague. Michael, good to see you here this morning. And the new government, with its 80-seat majority, will look at the legislation with fresh eyes and ask the question, is it fit for purpose? Early signs are that it will look again at loot boxes, the need for an ombudsman, reasonable limits to stakes and prizes with affordability checks, and a statutory levy for research and treatment. I welcome the government's commitment to review the legislation, and I'll be telling ministers loud and clear that a 15-year-old Act of Parliament covering gambling is about as much use as a Betamax or Friends Reunited. So the questions for all of us in this new environment are simple enough. How do we balance the needs of an industry with the need to prevent unnecessary harm and misery? How can the legitimate concerns of this important industry be heard without it seeming like an unreasonable desire to carry on regardless? How can we use our newfound relationships and, dare I say, friendships to forge consensus? How can we avoid a repeat of the rancour over the FOBTs fiasco? My final thought is this. If we can't forge that reasonable, evidence-based consensus on the way forward, the result will definitely not be business as usual. No, the result will be tougher, more draconian approaches driven by those who believe that what you do is morally wrong and that the job of government and regulators is to stamp you out like liquor or big tobacco. Now, I'm confident that we can work together, that today's invitation is a signal of good faith on all sides, that there is a growing belief that reform can work for all, industry and consumer alike. Very few want total prohibition. Very few want total liberalisation. Each position is as extreme and unworkable as the other. One delivers Peaky Blinders, the other delivers Dodge City. In the middle ground stand most of us, neither gangsters nor cowboys, instead reasonable, decent, fair-minded, willing to listen and ready to collaborate. And in that spirit, I look forward to taking your questions. Have a good conference.
Hi, good afternoon or good morning. My name is John from Vanuatu Lottery Corporation. Just have a quick question for you. You mentioned you had a 2018 gambling review, I believe it was. Is that available for us to view? And after that review was completed, what was learned and what was implemented that made all the change for the better?
Yeah, thanks for that question. That was an internal review in the Labour Party done by my team, and it was supposed to be the foothills of a manifesto process that takes 5 years, but sadly we keep having elections every 2 years in the UK. So the review didn't culminate in a heavy policy document, but it did lead to some of the calls on things like whistle-to-whistle advertising bans. But if we can follow up afterwards, and I'll put you in touch with all the evidence we took as part of that review.
That'd be brilliant.
Sure. Okay, sorry.
I've got one actually. I just want to touch on as the first lawmaker to put forward a concrete plan for new controls such as mandatory limits on spending, staking and game speed. How do you feel about the gambling-related harm APPG's recommendation of a £2 online slot stake cap?
I don't want to be wedded to a particular figure. I do think the industry are looking at caps and curbs, and the preventative approach to how it gets there is really important. And having been through that journey on FOBTs, it seems to me that what the all-party parliamentary group are doing is shaking the tree. They're laying a stake in the ground as the start of a debate, and really laying down a challenge to the industry to come back with what might be an appropriate solution. But I certainly think you need to take the report very seriously.
Also, following on from that, what if it's claimed that the Gambling Commission is not fit for purpose?
Again, it's not my job to beat up on the UK regulator, particularly because they've been hugely pressured in recent years by the forces of Parliament, industry and the consumer interest. But it does seem to me that where we're at is, the challenge to the regulator is to understand where government sort of wheel is going, and that is yet undecided. There is still a window of opportunity for the industry to define what it sees as reform. In that, it's got to engage stakeholders, and whether government decides to give the regulator more teeth or to encourage it to use the powers it already has is really down to the gambling review and how the industry responds to the challenges within that, I think.
A bit dazzled here. Do we have anyone else? One gentleman down here.
Can you help me understand specifically what could be achieved under a new Gambling Act that couldn't be achieved under the existing Gambling Act?
I think what you are alluding to are the secondary powers in the 2005 Act, which could give the regulator the power to, greater teeth. There are certainly, the one issue that definitely needs legislative look is on loot boxes, where the current Act is not fit for purpose. So I guess really the challenge is, can the industry find ways to deal with problems not covered by the Act that don't require a legislative route?
I'm just going to close it off with one more question from me. I think.
Sure.
Do you feel executives in the industry are aware of the scale of the task ahead in the next few years?
I do actually, yeah. I've been very pleasantly surprised by the conversations I've had with leaders in the industry, and this is really why I'm here today, because I think everyone acknowledges the recent parliamentary years have not been good for both Parliament and industry. And I see a new sense of collective purpose. The one thing I will say for the industry, which is very complex, very technical, very diverse, when engaging Westminster, it's always good to hide the wiring. Speak with one voice. If there's a cacophony of voices around Westminster with individual representatives of each company or sector, you end up with a sort of Parliament not hearing the message, which is why I think the sort of role of the BGC will be really important in the years ahead.
On that note, Mr. Watson, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Have a good conference.